All right, thanks everyone for joining. This is the data meeting presentation. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be opening up the hood and showing you a behind the screens look of the building of the MicroStrategy World application, which was built on top of MicroStrategy. So we're going to be showing you all the dashboard objects and everything that went into that. By way of background, my name is Mark Mayorga. This is Corinne DeKine. She is the Director of Creative Services at Data Meeting. We also have Daniel Beelan, who is the Manager of Creative Services at Data Meeting, and he also runs a lot of our marketing campaigns as well. In terms of who we are, I'll just glaze through this slide really quick. You know, the biggest feedback that I've always received is that you are here for the meat and bones, not about who we are. You can always ask us about that later. We're a business intelligence consultancy. We are a systems integration partner and a tier 1 MicroStrategy partner. We do not build software, we implement it. We do end-to-end solutions, and we work within the business intelligence space and business intelligence alone, end-to-end, everything from gathering requirements to the education and training once we have delivered the application. And these are just a summary of some of our skill sets and competencies in that image below. In terms of key differentiators, and this will be the very last slide I promise about us, design, we have an entire team that's fully dedicated to only design and design alone. We have built over 2,500 customizations and done portal integrations. And we also have an entire Data Meeting University, so it's a team that's fully dedicated to education and training. And by way of agenda, just so we could get into the meat and bones, today, again, we're going to be talking about the building of the MicroStrategy World application. We'll start off, or should I say Corinne will start off with the overall process. Everything from speaking to MicroStrategy about the application, starting in that discovery process, to the development, and we're going to open up the hood again, show you those MicroStrategy components that went into building the application that you're using right now. We're going to give it all to you. And then we'll turn it over to Daniel, who will focus more on the design background behind the application. We also try to make this in such a way that those recommendations will be general design recommendations that you can leverage for pretty much any mobile application or any web-based application where you're going to be delivering that information to your end users, and then we'll ultimately open it up to Q&A. We do have a lot of information to cover in a little bit of time, so we just ask that we try to hold those questions towards the very end. So now I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Corinne, who will be talking about the process. I will probably interject here and there whenever I feel the need to sound smart. So Corinne, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Marvin. So I'm going to be talking today about our process as it pertains to the MicroStrategy World App. So I'm going to take you through the discovery process all the way to deployment. So starting with the discovery process, so we met with MicroStrategy in October of last year, and we brainstormed with them ideas for requirements and established a wish list. From that, the Data Meeting design team came back and did some research. So we researched the most popular conference app. And why this is important is it decreases the cognitive burden, because now we know what users are already familiar with, so we can incorporate similar elements in a similar workflow. And after that, we presented a proposal to MicroStrategy. Alright, so here are some sample pages from our research documentation. So as you can see on the left, we researched what were the most popular schedule agenda styles, the welcome page, and even the navigation. And then on the right are the most popular conference apps based on the number of attendees. So after the proposal was signed off on, we really dove into the design process. So first and foremost, we start with a storyboard. And a storyboard is a visual representation of the actual application. So at Data Meeting, we guarantee a 95% WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. So from the storyboard to the final application, they're near identical. And then once we finished the storyboard, we reviewed with MicroStrategy, made some very minor changes, and received sign-off. So the next few slides highlight some of those pages from that initial storyboard. So you'll notice the welcome screen. This is version 3, the one you see today on the application. We actually submitted 3 different versions for MicroStrategy to select from. The next screen is the navigation. So not only do we show the design, but we show how the user is going to interact, where they would tap, where they would scroll. And the last is just a sample of a subsection, so in this case social. And the storyboard was over 25 pages long. So again, we highlight every single screen, and this gives our developers a roadmap for what's going to be developed. So after the storyboard got signed off on, we went to the preparation process. And this is our secret sauce to guaranteeing that 95% WYSIWYG. So we started out by exporting those images, and there was over 300, and that was mainly based on the number of speakers and sponsors for this event. The next was to produce a style guide. So this is documentation for developers. It highlights the hex codes, the font styles, even the sizes and positioning. So anyone that's in marketing, this is similar to a brand guide that you send out to your teams. And then lastly, we built the templates. So again, because our designers have technical certifications, we're able to build those for our developers. So they don't have to do any guessing games on where they should place this particular item or this particular title, because that's already done for them. So they can focus on that core functionality. And again, here are some sample pages from that style guide. So you'll notice we highlight the font, the positioning, everything that makes up the screens. And the next slide is for some technical folks in the audience who are going to be rolling up their sleeves and actually, building the application, some tips and tricks for exporting and inserting images. So I don't know if many folks know, but we actually export two images per graphic. And why is that? Well, because 1x images are actually used on those lower resolution devices. So we're talking about the iPhone 4, 4S, 5, which still exists today. And then we have the 2x images. So these are for our larger pixel dimension devices. So our iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. And MicroStrategy is smart enough to use, based on device, which one to use, and that's based off the native code. So here are the tricks for inserting those into the dashboard. So if you go into MicroStrategy Web, you're going to go ahead and insert that image. We're going to start off with the 1x image in our path. So in this example, it's youtube.png. Now we're going to hit apply. And what this image is going to do is it's going to snap to those dimensions. Now here's the tricky part. We're actually going to insert the @2x image within the path. So right before .png, we want to do @2x. Now here's the trick. We're going to hit OK and not apply. So now we're referencing the 2x image, but at the 1x dimensions. And once you save the document, the 2x image is going to snap to those 1x pixel dimensions.
A couple of things to note here. Number one, this is kind of obvious, right? You see there that there's a relative path that we're referencing, and the reason that's really important is because of migrations. When you go from development to QA to production, you want to have that relative path so you're not having to change that IP address within every separate environment. So I think that that's kind of a given, and everybody kind of knows that. The other thing to really note here is, in our experience, we rarely see developers truly taking advantage of the 1x and the 2x. One of the good things about the MicroStrategy tool that many of the other competitors don't provide out there are the fact that you can actually, this is part of when they talk about that mobile deployment, it truly is leveraging the native application. So this is one of those ways that you can truly increase that experience by having a very crisp image. And so if you really want to get that juice out of the tool, this is one of the ways that you can do it.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Marvin. So with that, let's dive into the development process. So we started with a data model, and the data model was based off the approved storyboard. So in other firms, you might notice they jump right into the data model, but at DataMean, we like to take the time to really understand the requirements, do the design before we start any development. And based off that data model, we went ahead and created the tables in this application. There was 27, and we were able to populate them with some initial data to start development. We also developed what's called store procedures to support transaction services. So transactions services can reference store procedure files. So for any web developers out there, it's like inline styles for CSS, hard-coded SQL for store procedures. And Marvin's going to get into the best practices on why you want to use store procedures. After that, we got into the application objects. So these are our metrics, our attributes, prompts. And based off that, we created reports. So there was 29 total transaction services / standard reports to support the application. And once those were built, we're able to build the front-end product, which is the documents within MicroStrategy. And there was 51 total documents to support the Android and Apple applications. So with that, I'm going to pause and turn over to Marvin to explain stored procedures.
And I'll just stand up so it can project out towards the back. This is actually something that I'm very happy to see that a lot of developers that we see out there are starting to incorporate into their development. So as you know, MicroStrategy has transaction services. This is the capability to actually go from a traditional reporting system where you're just displaying information to a source system where you're actually transacting and writing back. So you're actually creating your own data. Historically, this was done through a transaction services report where you would pump the SQL directly into the report. Well, guess what? That's not maintainable, it's difficult to troubleshoot, and it also doesn't perform well. So the best practices that we would recommend, hands down, when you're leveraging transaction services, leverage stored procedures. Stored procedures are pre-compiled code, so it'll perform a lot faster. You can pump in parameters, and guess what? You can actually build a dynamic enough stored procedure. If we go to the next, actually you probably have a little bit later, she'll show you can build dynamic enough code so that you can actually leverage one stored procedure for multiple transactions.
Thanks, Marvin. So with that, we're going to give you a behind-the-screen look into a couple of key pieces of functionality. And again, as Marvin mentioned, stop up here after the presentation or by our booth. We'll give you the storyboard, which also includes tech notes, screen by screen, how we accomplish what we're showing and what you guys are experiencing on the app today.
And Corinne, sorry to interject, but if I was just to put on my sales hat for just a moment, I would say that one of the things that we do offer is if you do have your in-house development team and just want to leverage us for our design skills and basically building out that entire footprint, this design document, which again we're going to give to you afterwards, includes technical notes. Those technical notes quite literally give you the blueprints to how we recommend you should do the stored procedure, where you should do the X and this within the document that we've designed, so that if you want, we can design it and you can build it yourself.
So getting back into stored procedures with transaction services, so you might be asking yourself, okay, great, but how do I do this? Well, it's similar to how you would configure transactions on a document today. That part doesn't change. So in this example, we're actually looking at the registered flag for the traps. So you'll notice we have a 1 and a 0. Are you registered, yes or no? And in this case, we're using the toggle to toggle between the images. So you'll notice within the application, highlights red if it's active. And at the bottom of the screen actually shows the transaction service report, and it actually executes that stored procedure, which in this case is called My Schedule. So on the next screen, this actually highlights a snippet of the code of the stored procedure. So there's actually 235 lines of code, and there's two stored procedures leveraged within the application.
We probably don't want to bore you with all the code, but this document also in this presentation we will follow up and give to you as well, so that you can get the general idea of the stored procedure also.
The next piece of functionality I wanted to highlight is the custom navigation. So if anyone has the app handy, you can actually pull this up and follow along with me. But within the actual document, we use a transparent image that overlays over the list icon. So you might be asking yourself, okay, why? Well, the tap area is increased, so now we're able to make it easier for users to hit that button. And the actual transparent image links to the navigation panel. And then at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice we actually highlight what the navigation panel looks like. So it's set to open as an information window. By default, it will open in full screen, and it's going to slide in from the left to create that more custom feel. But the cool part about the navigation is that the background stays fixed and that the buttons scroll up. So how we did that was we did nested panel stacks. So we have our parent panel stack, which is actually set to clip. And it contains that Miami background. It creates the gradient fade at the bottom and the footer images. And within that parent panel is also that nested panel stack. So the nested panel stack is what contains all those buttons. And I know it's a bit hard to see, but again, you'll get the presentation afterwards so you can take a closer look. But it's going to contain all those buttons, and that panel is actually set to scroll, and that's how we accomplish the fixed background with the scrolling buttons. And then lastly, we used document sections. So if you look at the document structure, there's three main sections. There's the page header. So this is the red bar across the top, and it's going to contain the icon and the title. Below that we have the details section, and we use dynamic text boxes and images. And then because we're using the details section, now it's going to repeat one row, and in this case for each sponsor. And then on top of that, we overlay a big button. So when you click the sponsor, using the URL API, it actually passes that prompt answer to the sponsored detail document.
And Corinne, talking about a big button, I'm not sure if anybody knows, but there's actually a treasure hunt that we put inside the application. So if you happen to find it, you'll win a Starbucks $5 Starbucks gift card. And that's got a big button somewhere. If you click on it, it'll do something. Just like,
thanks. And then lastly, the detail footer. So we contain the navigation within the detail footer just to make sure the document stays nice and tidy. And then with that, after development, we went into QA. So we created a log which allowed us to track issues in real time. We enlisted the help from over 10 developers from the Data team alone, and MicroStrategy also helped test the applications. We tested on 5 different device types, and this resulted in over 500 issues. So although not a key differentiator here at Data, we pride ourselves in the level of quality assurance we provide. So would most companies log this many issues? Well, maybe not, but we think that it's the little details that make the biggest difference. And then lastly, the deployment process. So we pushed the applications to the App Store and Google Play, and we're able to integrate Usher technology with beacons, which you presented in the keynote session.
one of the big things to note about when you're deploying to the App Store, just note that they will test it. So they will run up about 6,000 users as soon as you deploy that app. So even though you may only be deploying to 100, 1,000, 2,000 users, just be prepared because they're going to crash it. So just scale your servers at that point while they're testing it as soon as you deploy it to over 6,000 users so that it doesn't crash the app. You can scale it back maybe in the week.
So with that, I'm actually going to turn over to Daniel Beelan, and he's going to talk about UX recommendations to make your application successful.
Well, after taking a step through the MicroStrategy application and looking at the development and design process that we went through there, I want to take a little time to speak from our expertise in the design realm and focus on a couple topics that you can take and then apply to any design and development projects moving forward, whether that's a dashboard or a mobile application. So I'm going to be focusing on 3 topics: the paradox of choice, the rise and fall of the menu icon, and working with the fold. So let's start with the paradox of choice. You may be asking, what do you mean by that? What is this paradox? There's a widely held belief that choice is good and having multiple choices must be better. Well, not so fast. That may be true in some instances. However, the truth is, the reality is, the more options we present, the more choices we present to a user, the longer it's going to take them to make that decision, the harder it's going to be to make that decision. So there is a balance there that you need to walk as far as providing that functionality but not overwhelming your users. A real life example of this, think about going into a grocery store and walking down the cereal aisle and hundreds of choices to pick from, or trying to pick a lunch spot with coworkers. Do you find it's easier to make that decision if you have 2 options as opposed to 20? Choice is great. It gives us the freedom to choose. It gives us the ability to customize our experience, and it's a way of expressing ourselves, a personal expression. However, there is a bad side to it as well. There's a negative side where if there are too many choices, it becomes harder to make a decision. It takes us longer to make a decision. There was a British researcher, Dr. William Hick, who looked at this. He was trying to find a correlation between decision time and the amount of options presented. So he was studying what was information processing and human ergonomics to try to come up with that time it takes to process information, make a decision, and then take action on that decision. What he found is that the relationship between reaction time and the number of options presented is logarithmic. So if you start with 2 options and then you add another one in, the reaction time is going to double each time you add another option.
And Daniel, I'll just interject here really quick. I think, it's obvious, some of these things are quite obvious, and I think a lot of us know this already. The reason this is really, really important is because you ultimately need to drive that conversations with your users. And these are the studies, these are the numbers that help you drive those conversations. So let's be honest, we all kind of know that you don't want to put 50 different metrics on a dashboard. The question is, how can you convince your users that you shouldn't put 50 metrics on a dashboard? And this is how we do it. You have to give them the science so that you can really start to socialize that concept and have them buy in to these simplistic designs.
Yep, exactly. Thanks, Marvin. So another example, you guys already had lunch, thankfully, so another food example. But say we're at the grocery store and I'm trying to pick out a type of jelly, and I'm choosing between strawberry and grape. Well, that's only 2 options. That's not very difficult. But if I add another one in, orange marmalade, now I've just doubled my reaction time. It's going to take me twice as long to make that decision. 3 options, that's not necessarily that difficult of a decision still. But once we start talking about 8, 10, 12, 20, 30, 40 options that we're presenting to the user, at some point that becomes untenable and it's just too overwhelming to the user. So, bringing it back to the purpose of this presentation, how does this relate to design? Well, as a UX design best practice, we try not to overwhelm our users. We try not to have information overload or even decision paralysis with too many choices. We try to keep our applications simple, try to keep the design easy to navigate, easy to understand, so that there isn't that problem of too much time between initial digestion and action. So some practical tips. Identify the menu items that you really need. What are the most important menu items so that you can keep that number low and not have it be too overwhelming. Keep the layouts organized, categorized, so it is even easier for a user to navigate through them. Reduce the redundancy and any unnecessary choices. That's an easy way to eliminate the total or reduce the total number. And ultimately, focus on usability over capability. It's really easy to throw a lot of things in a dashboard, but if we ask the question about how is this going to affect usability, ultimately you'll get a better result from a UX perspective. We can take a look at a couple examples. Here's what not to do. If you look on the left side here, there's a whole bunch of options to pick from, and each one of those options gives you even more options. So just imagine how long it's going to take a user to actually get to the information they're trying to find on this page. Instead, let's look at what Twitter's homepage looks like right now. It's very simple, it's clean, there are only a couple big pictures, it's nicely laid out, and right across the middle there are categories. Categories help the user, guide the user to the information they're looking for without having to find that specific item. Another example, let's look at Foursquare. This is what Foursquare looked like before. Then they redesigned it. This is what it looked like after. Much more simple, much more clean. You see, once again, there are some categories to choose from, or even better, you can type in the search field and go directly to what you're looking for. So to summarize, the paradox of choice. Choice can be good, can allow you to customize your experience, but there is also a consideration you need to take into mind when you are building dashboards, design dashboards. You need to keep things clean, simple, avoid information overload, and limit those menu items and navigation items so that we don't make the application so difficult to work with that it can affect overall adoption.
And how we apply this to the MicroStrategy app is you'll notice on the welcome page we limited it to a couple of key features to direct the users to the most important sections, but had that navigation available as a secondary action.
And we're also going to provide the reference to the Hick study as well, so that you can also have that in order to be able to drive those conversations with your users.
Absolutely, yep. Moving on to the next topic, where do we go with the information we just learned? We were just talking about limiting the number of options, limiting the number of choices. Well, one of the most popular things to do, one of the most popular approaches, is to move navigation into a menu. Let's move it off of the screen, let's put it behind an icon, consolidate those choices into one place. But let's take a little bit closer look at that as well. The menu icon actually had its start back in the early 80s. One of the very first graphic interfaces by Xerox utilized the menu icon. The purpose of it was to consolidate navigation choices, consolidate functionality into one place so it was easy for users to go and find the option they were looking for. Fast forward to today, navigation menus and the menu icon is very popular. You see it in a lot of places, especially on smartphones and tablets. Designers like to use the menu icon for a couple different reasons. First of all, it helps to simplify the design, like we were just talking about with Hick's Law. Helps to simplify the design and consolidate the navigation into one place. The mobile devices are smaller. You have precious real estate to work with, so putting navigation into a menu helps use the real estate on the phone to the best ability, and ultimately reduces clutter. The user isn't necessarily going to need all of the choices in the navigation. They're only looking for one. So that's why a lot of designers choose to use an expanding navigation and a menu icon. However, if we take a closer look at it, the menu actually requires one additional step. You're asking the user to tap on a menu icon to see the menu and then choose from the menu which option they want to follow. The icon itself, often referred to as a burger icon, only because it resembles a hamburger if you're really hungry. The icon itself isn't necessarily that intuitive when you really think about it. A lot of us are used to menu icons by now, but the icon itself isn't what the user is looking for. What they're looking for is behind that icon. And finally, the menu icon itself doesn't leave an information scent, and by that I mean it doesn't provide a path or a trail that helps the user see where they came from and where they're going, similar to a breadcrumb trail.
And just to tee you up, Daniel, what Daniel's about to get into right now, this is, as one of our customers says, this is going to be the golden nuggets, right? I think that we're all familiar with navigation icons. This is the nuance that he's about to get into right now that's really, really important, and the effect on user experience.
Yep, absolutely. So I'd like to start with an example from NBC News, NBCnews.com. This was a redesign they did a couple of years ago where they decided to consolidate their navigation options into a menu. You can see the menu icon in the upper left there. Once again, all of the benefits of a menu icon, they wanted to consolidate that navigation, allow their users to go to one place to navigate to the different categories or different articles that they were looking for. However, they found that users weren't having a great experience with it. They were having a hard time finding the articles they were looking for. It wasn't very intuitive. It required multiple steps, it required multiple clicks to get to that information they were looking for. And some people were flat out confused. They didn't know where they needed to go. So, next step in the progression, NBC decided to add a tutorial screen. Tutorial screens are great and they can be very helpful. And NBC said, this will help guide our users to the menu so they can get to the item that they're looking for. This helped a little bit, but it still didn't get to the point where NBC wanted to go. So the next step is highlight it. Let's make the menu icon bright yellow, and let's add bright yellow here, and bright yellow there, and bright yellow there. Well, this didn't really work out very well for them. They actually got a lot of negative feedback from users saying that this is too much, too many flashing bright colors. it's overwhelming to me, and I'm still having a hard time getting to the information I'm looking for. So ultimately, NBC went back to a category list in a subheader below the main header that allowed the user, with one click, to navigate to the category that they were most interested in, as well as simplifying the general layout below. So once again, before and after. The result was NBC found that this was a much more popular layout and their users were much happier with it. A couple other examples I'd like to step through. Here's a mobile app. Before, you can see that there are some buttons here near the top of the screen, and after, they consolidated these buttons into a navigation drawer or a navigation menu. The result was engagement time dropped. It was cut in half. Weekly and daily frequency dropped. Time spent in the app dropped. None of those are good things. Another example, before, we have 3 options up top where you can select which one you're most interested in. After, they're consolidated into a toggle menu where you have to tap the menu first to see the options, and you can only actually see one option at a time. And you see the result there on the right side. The daily engagement in the app dropped significantly as soon as they made this change to the menu. So, enough doom and gloom, enough negativity. Is there a better way? The answer is yes, there is a better way. A lot of designers now of mobile applications, and we're spending a lot of time talking about smartphones, that's because it is a small screen, it's a small medium, you have to make the most of the real estate you have. But a lot of designers are using somewhat of a hybrid approach now, where they are presenting the most popular items, the most popular choices to the user using icons, using a tab navigation across the bottom of the screen. Bottom of the screen, from a usability standpoint, is really easy to reach with your thumb, especially when you're holding your phone with one hand. But you have these options, these most popular options available to you with one tap, and then if there are additional menu items needed, they could be moved into a separate menu.
And Daniel, just by way of how this relates to the application, so you could do this probably one of 2 ways. I'm sure that there are more. One way is you could just have a conversation with your users and take a quick poll to understand what are those primary navigation points that they want to go to first. The other way that we're very familiar with is leverage in our case, for example, MicroStrategy Enterprise Manager. Enterprise Manager is the pre-built tool that basically sits on top of metadata, and you can report on what documents are being accessed, what reports are being accessed. You get the idea. Well, guess what? We talked earlier that this application is supported by 57 document objects. So if you look at the navigation, when you're going to a separate page, whether it's the sponsors or the speakers or my agenda, that's a separate document object. So what you want to do is first, you want to release the entire navigation, just kind of pick and choose what you think are the top items that they want to go to. You could do that first, but then you can also sit in Enterprise Manager report on top of that application to start telling you what are the places that they're going to next. So there's kind of 2 ways that you could do that. You can sort of pick and choose which one's most efficient for you.
Right, absolutely. Thanks, Marvin. Here's another example. I think you're familiar with this probably. This is Facebook. Facebook, before, they had a menu icon. A lot of their navigation options were in that menu that expanded out. And after, they took 4 of the most popular options, 4 of the choices that users needed the most or accessed the most, and put them in a tab bar so they're quickly accessible. And then our friend the hamburger over there on the right side is there to provide the user the opportunity to go see any additional options that don't fit into that top priority category. And Facebook found that engagement, satisfaction, revenue, and speed all went up just by making that change. So it can make a significant difference. Here's another example. This is Red Booth. Before, they had a hamburger menu. They had an expanding out menu from the left side. And after, they similarly took some of the top choices and put it in a tab bar so they're quickly, easily accessible for their users. Sessions doubled, session time went up by 70%, and the daily users went up by 65%. So to summarize, What is the rise and fall of the menu icon? Well, as I said in the beginning, menu icons aren't necessarily bad. There are good, and there is a very good use case for them from a design standpoint. However, there are some limitations, and there are some things you need to consider. And during a discovery process, you need to think about what does a user actually need. Are there some things that are higher priority than others? And consider taking a hybrid approach where you present those top priority items up front without requiring additional action to get to them. And then any additional menu items can be put in a navigation menu to once again utilize the screen to its maximum capacity.
Yeah, so as Marvin mentioned, we took a hybrid approach for the MicroStrategy World application, and that you'll notice the welcome screen contains 6 key components that a user can jump right into, but there's also that list icon for the secondary options for further information.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Corinne. So finally, I'd like to wrap up by talking about working with the fold. And once again, this follows along with the theme so far of how are we presenting information to our users? How are we laying out our design so that it is the best user experience possible? So what is the fold? The fold, this term actually comes from newspapers. When newspapers were printed on paper, the most important information was printed on the top of the page because the reader, not the user, the reader had to physically unfold the newspaper to see the rest of the articles at the bottom of the page. But for the digital age, the fold actually refers to the bottom edge of whatever device you're looking at, whether it's a laptop or a tablet or a smartphone. So the fold on a digital device is the bottom edge of the screen, and anything, quote, above the fold is the information that is visible on that screen before scrolling. Let's take a little trip down memory lane. In the early to mid-90s, because of the advent of the internet and web and just the familiarity with computers in general, a lot of people didn't know about scrolling, didn't know how scrolling worked, and didn't know that web pages could scroll. Therefore, there was a lot of information at the bottom of these pages that wasn't even being seen. So the result was the requirement became all information needs to be visible on the screen without any scrolling. No scrolling, just has to be there. So from a design standpoint, the result ended up being a little bit cramped design. It was a little tight, wasn't necessarily the easiest to navigate through, and obviously you're limited on the total amount of information you can communicate because you only have so much space to work with. The reality is, even though that was a while ago, this mentality still carries through to today. A lot of people still believe that scrolling is bad and information needs to be visible without scrolling. But is that true? Short answer is no. And why is that? Well, the reality is we as users of technology, using laptops or smartphones or iPads, we are familiar with the scrolling motion. We know that scrolling will get us more information, and we want that information. Think about some popular applications out there, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or Pinterest. I can just keep scrolling. There's a universal scroll, and more information will just keep coming up. So when you do usability tests, and here are some examples from Chartbeat, but if you run usability tests, you will find that majority of users, their attention, 66% of the attention of users is spent below the fold. And then the pixels at the top of the page are actually in view for the shortest amount of time, only about 4 seconds. And as far as ease of use and speed of use, it's much easier for a user to scroll rather than finding pagination and going from page 1 to page 2 to page 3 and on from there. As you can see on the graph, with an average screen height of 768 pixels, you can see that engagement actually peaks below the fold. So if you're thinking about when are users going to be most interested in the information that they're looking at, it's actually below the fold, not at the top of the page. When looking at scroll depth, How far are people actually scrolling down the page? How much information are they trying to gain by scrolling? Find that on home pages, 50% of readers scroll past the fold and go 1,000 pixels down the page. And on content pages, 50% go past the fold 1,500 pixels down the page. And if you look at the graph, one of the interesting things about this graph is that you see that many visitors are actually starting to scroll the page before it finishes loading. Think about that, what that means regarding where we put our information on the screen. Another case study, a great example is Apple. Apple in 2011 decided that scroll bar was no longer the default. They didn't need to display the scroll bar because they knew it was such a familiar experience to their users that that visual cue was no longer necessary. Another example, whether you want to admit you know this website or not, there's a website called TMZ.com, and it's a popular celebrity gossip website. Over 15 million people monthly go and visit it. Really interesting thing about their homepage is it's 15,000 pixels long. So that means that of those 15 million people that are visiting it monthly, TMZ knows that they will continue scrolling 15,000 pixels down the page. Take it a step further, the most clicked link on that home page is actually at the bottom of the page, not the top of the page. And that link, believe it or not, takes them to the next page. So, what does this mean from a design standpoint? Let's bring it all back to implications or recommendations. Because of scrolling and the popularity of scrolling, ease of scrolling, we don't need to squeeze all the information up at the top like those early AOL screens. We don't need to be afraid of the fold. We don't need to avoid the fold. We can actually encourage our users to embrace the fold and have information below the fold by using a cutoff look, where you actually hint at the fact that there's more information below the edge of the screen so that they are curious and act upon that and scroll down the screen, scroll down the page. The most important information, such as navigation, should still be visible. You see we have header bars on these examples, and some of that most important information is still available at the top of the screen because we still do read from top down, but we don't need to be afraid of putting information below the fold. 2 more points. Because of the ease of scrolling, it's a good thing to consider using scrolling rather than pagination in order to allow users to find that additional information. If you're interested in learning more from us, we do have a YouTube channel where we post videos about UX design recommendations. And with that, I would like to open it up for any questions. And thank you for your time.